Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to look at an argument for normative realism given by David Enoch in his book Taking Morality Seriously. This is the argument from deliberative indispensability, and this is an argument, as I say, for normative realism rather than for moral realism specifically. It is an argument for the claim that there are objective, irreducibly normative truths. So to unpack this a little bit, Enoch is going to argue for truths that are normative in that they tell us what we ought to do, what we should do. They are irreducibly normative, which is to say they cannot be identified with purely natural facts. For instance, the facts about what you ought to do cannot be identified with people's desires. And they are objective in that they are independent of anybody's beliefs about them. So, in principle, everybody might be wrong about what the normative truths are. We discover the normative truths, we do not create them. Now, this obviously doesn't in itself establish moral realism, because we might think that there are such normative truths. We might think there are truths about what you ought to do, or what you ought to think, how you ought to reason, whatever, even if there are no moral truths. Even so, Enoch does present this as part of a cumulative case for moral realism. If we can establish that there are objective, irreducibly normative truths in general, that does go some way towards answering some of the standard criticisms of moral realism, at least. So yeah, let's look at his argument. So the basic idea is that objective, irreducibly normative facts are indispensable for deliberation, and this indispensability justifies belief in their existence. The argument basically goes like this: if X is instrumentally indispensable to an intrinsically indispensable project, then we are justified in believing that X exists. Premise 2, deliberation is intrinsically indispensable. Premise 3, objective, irreducibly normative truths are instrumentally indispensable to deliberation. So conclusion, we're justified in believing that there are objective, irreducibly normative truths. Now this might look a bit confusing at the moment, but don't worry, we will go through the premises. But before doing that, so this is an argument about deliberation, right? What exactly do we mean by deliberation? Well, we're using the term in the standard sense, right? This is just the process of trying to work out what it would be best for you to do, or what it would be best for you to believe, or whatever. So suppose you're asking yourself whether to pursue a PhD in philosophy. There are many things that you will weigh up. You will ask yourself, how will I fund it? What are the long-term career prospects? How good of a philosopher am I? How much do I enjoy doing philosophy? What topic would I research? Will I be able to get the right kind of supervision? What other options are there for me? And so on. You're going to think about all these things and you're trying to work out whether doing a philosophy PhD would be a good idea. Or maybe you're going to think to yourself, what should I have for dinner tonight? And there you have to weigh up how much you like the food, how much the ingredients will cost, how easy it is to prepare. Maybe if you're cooking for other people, you'll have to, weigh up how they're going to react to the food and so on. So you're weighing up all of these things to come to a decision about what would be a good thing to cook. This is deliberation, right? We engage in deliberation all the time, from momentous choices to fairly mundane ones. So with that in mind then, why does Enoch think that deliberation commits us to objective, irreducibly normative truths? Well, Enoch is giving a kind of indispensability argument, and to explain this, he first of all discusses a much more common indispensability argument, the argument from explanatory indispensability. So there's a classic argument against moral realism from Gilbert Harman. Harman asks us to compare two cases. In the first case, a physicist sees a vapor trail in a cloud chamber and thinks to herself, there is an electron in the cloud chamber. Now, we take her observation to be evidence that there is indeed an electron in the cloud chamber. Why? Well, because that's the best explanation for her observation. The best explanation for why the physicist formed this belief is that there is indeed an electron in the cloud chamber. We have a physical theory that specifies the mechanism by which the electron formed the vapor trail, and then by which light interacts with the vapor trail, enters the physicist's eye, and so on. And that whole thing, that's the best explanation we have for why she formed her belief. If there were some better alternative explanation for the physicist's observation, which did not postulate electrons, then her observation would provide no reason to believe that there is an electron in the cloud chamber. In the second case that Harman considers, somebody watches a group of hooligans set a cat on fire and forms the judgment, that's morally wrong, or they ought not to do that. Now, Harman says the best explanation for why they formed that judgment does not require postulating some property of wrongness inhering in the actions of the hooligans. It's enough to cite the physical properties of the action, so things like holding a lighter to the cat's fur, the squealing of the cat, the smell of burning flesh. It's enough to cite those physical properties combined with various facts about the observer, so her psychology, her upbringing, her cultural background, and so on, right? That is enough to explain why she forms the judgment that the behaviour of the hooligans is morally wrong. And the thought is that this is going to be generalizable to all moral judgments. So we only need to cite non-moral facts, like the physical facts plus facts about people's sensibilities, to explain the moral judgments that people make. Moral properties, Harman thinks, are explanatorily impotent, so we have no reason to believe in them. Now, if this kind of argument is proposed as a case for anti-realism, then there's sort of two assumptions at play. So first of all, there's the no explanatory role assumption. The thought is that moral facts do not play an appropriate explanatory role. They are explanatorily dispensable. We don't need them to give, the best explanation available. Second, there is the explanatory requirement, which says that we're justified in believing in some purported fact only if that fact plays an appropriate role in explanations. So explanatory indispensability, playing the right kind of explanatory role, is necessary for belief in moral facts to be justified. Why might we accept something like the explanatory requirement? It's maybe worth thinking about this. So, on the one hand, why might we, believe in things that are part of our best explanations? Well, it's not obvious what other sort of criterion we could have to guide our ontological commitment. Arguably, we need to infer to the best explanation of things if we're to come to have any beliefs about the world at all. Many of my beliefs are based on perception. But why should I trust perception? After all, there's nothing logically inconsistent about the claim that all of my sensory data is just a hallucination. Maybe I'm dreaming, maybe I'm a brain in a vat, or whatever. Well, the usual argument here is that we trust our perception, we can justifiably trust our perception, because the best explanation of our perceptual impressions is that they are caused by external objects in the world, and that they represent the world with reasonable accuracy. This is what best explains the long-run stability and coherence of our sensory impressions. This explanation is the best because it's the simplest, it's not ad hoc, it has reasonable explanatory scope, I guess. That's the sort of line people will take, right? Like the best explanation for certain features of our perceptual impressions is that those impressions are in fact accurately tracking objects in the world. Why think that explanatory indispensability is necessary? Well, Enoch says this rests on a parsimony requirement. So, we want to have true beliefs about the world, but we don't want to be gullible, we don't want to fall into wishful thinking, we don't want to believe lots of false things. And a good rule of thumb that we can use to appropriately limit belief is Occam's razor. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. And for many philosophers, necessity here is taken to mean whatever is necessary in order for our best explanations to work. Something like this seems to be what underlies many of our negative existential beliefs. So why do I believe that the Loch Ness Monster does not exist? Well, because I don't need to postulate it in order to explain any of the observations around Loch Ness, because, it's a very poor explanation insofar as it's hard to square with our general knowledge of biology and evolutionary history, because if I assume that there is a Loch Ness Monster, I then have to make loads of ad hoc assumptions in order to account for why we don't have conclusive evidence of it. Like, why is it sort of hidden? You have to make loads of ad hoc assumptions about why it hasn't been seen by so many other people, and so on. So it's a bad explanation. It's not part of any good explanation. That's why I don't believe in it. So the explanatory requirement seems to strike a good balance. If you form beliefs on the basis of inference to the best explanation, you will believe enough to successfully act in the world and to understand the world, but you'll also be appropriately skeptical and you will hold your beliefs to high evidential standards. So this is this is kind of the case then for moral anti-realism, right? Moral facts don't play an appropriate explanatory role, and we have the explanatory requirement. Now, one line that realists can take, and this is a reasonably common one, is to argue that normative facts actually do play an appropriate explanatory role. Enoch favours a second strategy. He thinks we should deny the explanatory requirement. So he just grants that normative facts are dispensable to our best explanations, right? We don't need them in our best explanations of phenomena. And he also says that we are committed only to those entities that are indispensable in a certain sense, right? So indispensability in a certain sense does matter, but he thinks that there are kinds of indispensability beyond explanatory indispensability. So, you know, this is going to be what should kind of guide our ontological commitments. So here's how this works. When we're giving an indispensability argument, it's important to distinguish between kind of two parts of it, right? We need to distinguish between what Enoch calls instrumental indispensability and intrinsic indispensability. So in the first place, an indispensability argument will need to explain what is it for something to be indispensable to a given project. This is going to be an account of, so what it is for X to be indispensable to some project, right? And this is what Enoch calls instrumental indispensability. Then second, we need to explain what projects are such that indispensability justifies belief. So under what circumstances can we say, if X is instrumentally indispensable to P, then belief in X is justified. This is what Enoch calls intrinsic indispensability. And this is important because if a given project as a whole is dispensable, then it really doesn't matter whether something is instrumentally indispensable to fulfilling that project. For example, the existence of God may be indispensable to the project of prayer. Plausibly, it doesn't make sense to pray to God, to ask God to do things for you and expect God to respond. It doesn't make sense to do that if you don't believe in God. So belief in the existence of God is instrumentally indispensable to praying. But this doesn't justify belief in God, because there's no need for us to pray. Prayer is optional. There's plenty of rational people who do not pray. So with this in mind, Enoch needs to make two claims. First, he's going to argue that deliberation is intrinsically indispensable. The deliberative project is non-optional for us. We can't just give it up in the way that we can give up prayer. Any rational agent must engage in deliberation. This is premise 2 of the argument I laid out earlier. Second, he will need to argue that irreducibly normative truths are instrumentally indispensable for deliberation. In order to engage in deliberation, we need to believe in objective, irreducibly normative truths. This is premise 3 of his argument. Now, with that said, there's an immediate objection here, which is that an argument like this is just confused at the outset. So you might say, well, look, if deliberation is indispensable and if normative truths are indispensable for deliberation, well, that shows that in some sense we need normative truths. But it doesn't show that there actually are any normative truths. Perhaps we are in the unfortunate position that we are required to, in some sense required, to adopt false beliefs or something like that, in order to engage in a practice that is central to our lives, right? Like we need normative truths. That's what this argument shows. But of course, the world is not designed for what we need. To suppose otherwise is just wishful thinking. So this argument, just doesn't really get off the ground, right? It doesn't show that there actually are any normative truths. But Enoch points out that the same could be said for explanatory indispensability. Explanatory indispensability, the argument would go, this shows that we need to postulate certain entities, such as electrons, in order to best explain the world. So we need to believe in electrons if we are to understand the world, if we are to make sense of the world. But this doesn't show that there actually are electrons. After all, the world is not designed for what we need. To suppose otherwise would be wishful thinking. Now, few philosophers would accept this kind of claim in the case of explanatory indispensability. At the very least, insofar as Enoch is directing the deliberative indispensability argument against philosophers like Harman, who gave the explanatory impotence argument, the use of explanatory indispensability as a guide to belief is a shared assumption. More generally, Enoch makes the point that given that there are these other kinds of indispensability, those who hold the explanatory requirement need to find some way to show that explanatory indispensability justifies belief, but other kinds of indispensability do not. So what is it that's so special about explanatory indispensability? Like when we ask the question, why does explanatory indispensability justify belief? We would need to make sure that the answer to that does not generalize to other kinds of indispensability. Enoch, of course, thinks it's unlikely that any such answer could be given here. I should note, incidentally, that Enoch does devote a fairly significant chunk of his chapter to explaining why it is that indispensability in general is a guide to ontology. But that gets into rather technical epistemology, and I don't think it's really necessary for the purposes of introducing Enoch's argument, which is what I'm doing here. So, yeah, if you want more detail on this point, you'll have to just read the book. Okay. So, let's take the first part, then. Intrinsic indispensability. What is it for a project to be indispensable? Well, the idea is that some projects are rationally non-optional. Any rational agent will be compelled to engage in that project. Arguably, this is the case for the explanatory project. We constantly infer to the best explanation of phenomena, and we use these explanations to understand the world and to guide our actions. We want to find out how the world works and what's happening in the world, both just for its own sake, because we seek knowledge, and also because that's kind of required in order for us to successfully achieve our goals. But in order to do this, inference to the best explanation is a crucial tool. So even if it's psychologically possible to stop inferring to the best explanation, that would be a bad idea, at least according to Enoch. Now, deliberation, it seems, is also rationally non-optional. Perhaps it's possible for us to completely disengage from deliberation. We are, after all, capable of making arbitrary decisions. If I'm hungry and I want some fruit, but I have no preference about whether to eat an apple or a banana, then I'll just pick one at random. So there you go, there's an arbitrary decision. Maybe it's possible for all of our decisions to become arbitrary like this, but it doesn't seem like this would be a rational option. It's hard to imagine what a person who never deliberates would be like. Right, somebody who never asks themselves what to do, what to care about, what to believe. This person, this human, wouldn't even be a person, perhaps. It would be like regressing to an infant state. If anything, it seems to me that the deliberative project is even more fundamental to us than the explanatory project. There are plenty of philosophers who are skeptical of the explanatory project. Rejection of inference to the best explanation is a common theme in the history of empiricism. So those of you like me who are inclined to empiricism will probably have some concerns about the idea that explanatory indispensability is a good guide to belief. But the point is that's actually a fairly common position in philosophy. But I think pretty much everybody agrees that it makes sense for us to engage in deliberation. So yes, this seems pretty plausible that deliberation is rationally non-optional, and in that sense, it is the deliberative project is indispensable. It has intrinsic indispensability. Okay, then let's turn to instrumental indispensability. What is it for something to be indispensable to a project? Well, the fact that something is useful to a project, that's not going to be enough. So think about, for instance, the indispensability argument for mathematical realism. So you can check out my video on Platonism in mathematics for more on that. God, that video was made a long time ago now, but it's still relevant. Anyway, the argument is that we're committed to the existence of mathematical entities because they are indispensable to our best scientific theories. So this is a kind of explanatory indispensability argument. Now, nobody doubts that mathematics is useful to the sciences, but mathematical entities might simply be tools that we use to simplify inferences or something like that. So a usual response from philosophers who are more inclined to anti-realist views of mathematics is to show that theories can be restated in non-mathematical terms, that theories can be nominalized. So the thought is that really our theories are not fundamentally mathematical. Rather, the mathematics is like a useful tool of representation. But we can make exactly the same claims without using mathematics. So because of that, mathematics is not indispensable. The use of mathematics in science, even though it is a very powerful tool, does not support realism about mathematical entities. So, it's not enough just to say that something is useful. We need to say something a bit more than that. Enoch's suggestion is as follows. He says that X is instrumentally indispensable for a project, just in case X cannot be eliminated without undermining or sufficiently diminishing whatever reasons we had to engage in that project in the first place. So, if we think about the case of explanatory indispensability, what is indispensable to the explanatory project? Well, whatever it is that our best explanations quantify over. If we came to believe that it is unlikely that whatever our best explanations quantify over exists, then we would lose our reason for engaging in the explanatory project. We would lose our reason for giving explanations. At least that's the case according to Enoch. So let's say we kind of recognise that the best explanation of certain phenomena appeals to electrons, right? But then we come to believe that there just are no electrons. In that case, we wouldn't be able to infer to the best explanation available, and so that would so by losing belief in electrons, right? We're no longer able to infer to the best explanation. That would like undermine inference to the best explanation. And similarly, similar things can be said for other projects. In the case of prayer, the point of praying to God is to affect things in the world. Maybe someone with cancer and you're praying for their recovery with the goal that prayer will help heal the cancer, right? Like that's the point, right? The reason for engaging in the project of prayer is to make some influence on the world. But that only makes sense if you assume that God exists and can hear your prayer and might act on it. If you lose your belief in God, you undermine your reason for engaging in prayer because you undermine any reason for thinking that prayer will be effective. So Enoch's claim then is that objective, irreducibly normative truths are instrumentally indispensable for deliberation. Why should we believe this? Well, recall the example of deliberating about whether to pursue a philosophy PhD. You ask yourself questions and you assume that those questions have answers, that some of those answers are better than others. And as a result, some of the answers to the general question, should I pursue a philosophy PhD, are better than others. Now, notice that you're not making an arbitrary choice. It's not like flipping a coin. Rather, you're trying to find out the right answer. Some choices would be right for you and others would be wrong. And the point is when you deliberate, right? When you deliberate like this, you are trying to discover something. So given your skills, given your interests, given the way the world is, the way that educational institutions work, given these facts, there is an answer as to whether it would be best for you to pursue a philosophy PhD. And this isn't simply up to you, right? It's not simply up to you what the answer is. It's not something you create. It's something that you discover through the process of deliberation. I mean, deliberation, Enoch thinks, has the same phenomenology as trying to work out the answer to a factual question. A question like, is there extraterrestrial life, right? Similarly, you're like weighing up the reasons for and against it. When deliberating, it feels as if there is a right answer to find. As Enoch defines it, deliberation is, and I quote, the process of trying to make the decision it makes the most sense for one to make. And there is a fact of the matter, what decision it would make the most sense for you to make. Now, according to Enoch, what determines the decision it would make the most sense for you to make are the reasons for and against that decision. So the point of deliberation is to reveal the reasons for and against particular actions. It is possible, of course, to choose in the absence of reasons. This is the case for the choice between eating an apple or eating a banana, right, where I have no preferences to guide me. I can make an arbitrary choice, but we cannot deliberate in the absence of reasons, or at least we cannot deliberate in the believed absence of reasons. If I take it that I have no reason one way or the other for any particular decision, then I can't try to work out what decision it would make the most sense for me to make. So when we're deliberating about what decision to make, we are committed to the existence of reasons for action. like that's because the whole point of deliberation, again, is to so the whole point of deliberation is to eliminate the kind of arbitrariness that's involved when we merely pick on a whim, right? And what it is that eliminates arbitrariness is the discovery of reasons. That's the distinction between, my decision to eat an apple rather than a banana on a whim, and my decision to eat an apple rather than a banana because I recognise, say, that the apple is less expensive, that the apple is tastier, whatever. In the latter case, what's happened is that I have come to recognise that I have all things considered reasons that favour eating the apple. Maybe another way to think about this is, like, suppose you're talking to a friend who wants advice on whether to pursue a philosophy PhD, and together you talk through the kind of questions we noted earlier. But then your friend says that it just doesn't matter one way or the other, that there are no reasons that count either in favour of or against any possible decision. Well, it's sort of difficult to make sense of such a person, right? They seem to be thinking in a way that is incoherent. Once we believe that there just are no reasons relevant to whether we should do X, we stop deliberating. Of course, it may still be that we have to make a choice, but it's going to be an arbitrary choice. To deliberate, we need to believe that there are reasons favouring one decision rather than another. Now, to say that something is a reason for you to perform some action, to say that something counts in favour of performing an action, that's a normative claim. When you deliberate, you ask questions like, what should I do? These are normative questions. And in deliberating, you're assuming that there are objectively right answers to these questions. Deliberation involves a commitment to normative truths. Now, recall Enoch's claim that X is instrumentally indispensable to a project, just in case X cannot be eliminated without undermining whatever reason we had for engaging in that project in the first place. Well, our reason for engaging in deliberation is to eliminate the arbitrariness of choices, and the way that we eliminate arbitrariness is by discovering objective reasons for action. We are trying to discover objective normative truths. We cannot eliminate them without undermining the point of engaging in deliberation. So objective normative truths are indispensable to deliberation. Okay, well that's the basic argument. Now, there is, I think, a fairly obvious response at this point, which is to say, well, look, we don't need objective normative truths for deliberation. We only need desires. Desires are enough to move us. Reasons for action, it might be said, are not irreducibly normative, but are reducible to our desires and the means of satisfying those desires. If it's raining, you have a reason to put on a coat. But what this reason amounts to is just the fact that, first of all, you have a desire to stay dry. Second, putting on the raincoat would be an easy way of achieving that desire. Third, it wouldn't violate any other relevant desires, right? Like, that's ultimately the sense in which you have a reason to put on a coat. Other choices obviously are going to appeal to much more complex sets of desires, but ultimately that's all you need. Any time you deliberate, you're weighing up various desires and how best to satisfy those desires. Perhaps I can't satisfy all my desires, but if I deliberate well, I can satisfy enough of them that I have a happy life. So it might be thought, well, like, there's just no need to kind of get into this idea of, like, objective, irreducible normativity. Desires are enough. Enoch argues desires are not enough. And the trouble is, and I quote, "When you allow yourself to settle a deliberation by reference to a desire, you commit yourself to the judgment that your desire made the relevant action the one it makes the most sense to perform." Okay, so why is this a problem? Well, as Enoch sees it, there are two ways to understand what's going on here. The first option is, there are two ways to think about the idea that reasons ultimately just come down to desires, right? So one thing you might say, if you think that reasons just come down to desires, you might say, well, this is because there is some general reason to satisfy your desires. So basically, the fact that some action will satisfy your desire, that counts as a reason to perform that action because it matters that your desire be satisfied. But now notice, this is the objective, irreducibly normative truth. The objective, irreducibly normative truth here is that it matters that you satisfy your desires. So on this approach, you haven't actually reduced reasons to desires. Desires only count as reasons because there is the more general, more fundamental, desire-independent reason to satisfy your desires, right? So yeah, if you think that, like, if you think that deliberation comes down to weighing up desires because you think that there's some general reason to satisfy your desires, then the general reason to satisfy your desires is not itself going to be that's not itself going to come down to desires. That's a desire-independent reason. So this is not going to work, right? Enoch thinks, in this case, we're still committed to objective, irreducibly normative truths. Well, the alternative is to embrace a genuinely reductionist line and to say that having a reason simply consists in having a desire. So James Lenman, in his article Deliberation, Schmeliberation, expresses this kind of view quite well when he says, "A space of reasons is a space of desires as a space of desires presents itself when those desires are one's own." To say that I have a reason to do X, this expresses the force I feel towards X, the motivation towards X that arises from having desires that point in some way towards X, and those desires are my own. So on this kind of view, I don't need to make the judgment that it is my desires that make X the action it makes the most sense to perform, nor do I need to make the judgment that I have a reason to satisfy my own desires or anything like that. No, having reasons just consists in having desires. So we'll call this reasons reductionism, and Enoch makes a couple of points in response to reasons reductionism. I have to say his response is a little bit obscure to me, actually, but I think there are two arguments that can be taken from his text. So the first is something like this. The trouble with taking reasons to consist in desires is that we can always ask about a given desire. We can always ask the question, should I have this desire? Or we can ask a question like, given that I have this desire, should I act on it? So we have to ask what weight to give our desires when we're trying to work out what to do. And, after all, it is common enough that we might take some of our desires to be irrelevant or immoral or something like that. I might have a strong desire to physically attack those who insult me, but I might also believe that it's better to avoid aggression, so I make an active effort to suppress that desire. Indeed, we might think that it would be possible for somebody to take the fact that they desire X as a reason not to do X. Right, so this person would make an active effort to avoid satisfying their desires. That's strange, but it's not immediately incoherent, right? So this is a problem, right? We can't just identify reasons with desires if we think it's coherent for somebody to take the fact that they desire X as a reason not to do X, and it seems like that might be coherent. So of course the response from the reasons reductionist will be that actually in these cases all of this is still ultimately grounded in our other desires. So our sets of desires are, after all, very complex, and when I ask a question like, should I have this desire, or given that I have this desire, should I act on it, when I ask a question like that, I'm appealing to a whole host of background desires. So perhaps I avoid aggression because I believe that a calm mind will help me reason better, or because I want a world in which people are peaceful, or whatever. Like, I can have desires for those things. And that's what constitutes my reason for kind of suppressing the other desire. As for the notion that somebody might take their desires to be a reason not to do something, well, let's consider a specific example. How would this work? Consider a person who believes that God has commanded all people not to satisfy their desires. And as a result, they take the fact that they desire X as a reason not to do X. But now the reasons reductionist will say, well, really this just amounts to a more fundamental desire to obey God's commands. Perhaps the person doesn't explicitly recognise that they have this desire, but that is what's actually motivating them. That is what their reason actually consists in. So in principle then, the notion of somebody having a reason to avoid satisfying all their desires across the board, that will turn out to be incoherent, or that's going to be the argument, I think. Enoch's second argument against the reductionist view, and I think this is what he takes to be the more significant, is this. The reasons reductionist will say that all my reasons are grounded in whatever my desires are. The trouble with this is that my desires are ultimately arbitrary, or at least my basic fundamental desires are arbitrary. So take the case of considering whether to pursue a philosophy PhD. Now suppose I know that my family would be disappointed if I were to do this. I then have to decide whether or not to give that any weight in my deliberation. Should I give consideration to their feelings? Well, if this ultimately just rests on my attitudes, on whether I desire to satisfy my family's desires, then it's arbitrary. It's just a matter of whether or not I care how they feel. Enoch thinks that this misses something important about deliberation. He says that since our kind of basic desires and attitudes are arbitrary, deliberation loses much of its appeal if normativity is taken to be dependent on those desires and attitudes. Again, the point of deliberation is to eliminate arbitrariness. If it just rests on our desires, which are ultimately arbitrary, then arbitrariness hasn't been eliminated. So once we give up on objective, irreducibly normative truths, the deliberative project is undermined. So this is the key point, right? Deliberation is supposed to eliminate arbitrariness. If reasons are just reduced to desires, then we don't eliminate arbitrariness because our desires are, in an important sense, arbitrary, right? Like we just have whatever desires we happen to have. So there's a couple of ways to counter this point, and this is discussed at length by James Lenman in his article Deliberation, Schmee-liberation. First, first point here is, so we do need to bear in mind there are different kinds of arbitrariness, right? Like, it's not clear that even our fundamental desires are arbitrary in the sense that choosing by flipping a coin is arbitrary. And this is because, as we noted, people have thousands of desires that interact in all kinds of ways. And any desire, even a desire that is in some sense fundamental or basic, can still be examined and criticised in the light of one's other desires. So we might say that in some sense the whole set of desires that you have is arbitrary. Certainly, I guess the desires that you start with, as it were, the desires that you just happen to have as a kid, that you're brought up with, maybe that's arbitrary. You could have had a very different set of desires. But it remains the case that, like, when you act on the basis of any particular set of desires, no desire in that set needs to be arbitrary, because it might have been shaped by critical evaluation, right? Critical evaluation that takes place in light of other desires. And, even if you haven't actually thought about your desire, it might still form part of a coherent web of desires. And it's not clear that that's like arbitrary in a problematic way. It doesn't seem to be arbitrary in the way that, like, choosing by flipping a coin is arbitrary. Second, and I think more importantly, even if we do think of our desires as just arbitrary, there is still a difference between merely picking without reason, like flipping a coin to choose, and then evaluating actions on the basis of reasons that are grounded in arbitrary desires, right? So we have certain desires that are just, let's say, basic, right? Like the desire to achieve happiness, to achieve knowledge, peace, prosperity, love, justice, security, varied experiences, challenging work, and so on. But of course, we can still try to do well with respect to these desires. We can evaluate what would be the best means of satisfying them. We can weigh up how to make trade-offs between them. That's very different from just picking something arbitrarily. So Lenman says, look, suppose that we just explicitly recognise that our desires are arbitrary, right? We just happen to have the desire for knowledge, prosperity, love, whatever. There's no reason for it. There's no fundamental reason for it. That's just how we happen to be constituted. And so we explicitly recognise that these desires have no foundation in objective normative reasons. But we would still evaluate our actions with respect to these desires. Lenman says that we should call this activity Schmee-liberation. It's not deliberation, at least it's not deliberation as Enoch conceives of it. When we appeal to a desire in deliberating, we take it that there is some objective normative reason to pursue that desire. Liberation explicitly denies this, right? Liberation explicitly does away with objective normative reasons. Now the thing is, it's clear enough that in liberating, there is still a standard of success. This standard is set by what our desires are. We can liberate well or badly. If I liberate badly, I might end up performing actions that render me alone, with no friends, in poverty, working a bad job, or dead, right? I can fail to act in such a way as to satisfy my arbitrary desires. So there's a standard of success. Moreover, liberating does not feel like making an arbitrary choice. Indeed, Lenman suggests it feels phenomenologically just like deliberating. In which case, why can't we make do with liberation? So this raises a problem for Enoch, right? Suppose we just grant that objective, irreducibly normative truths are indispensable for deliberation. The trouble is it's no longer clear why deliberation would be rationally non-optional. So, Enoch needs to show both that normative truths are instrumentally indispensable for deliberation, but also that deliberation is an intrinsically indispensable project. Lenman's objection is that any account of deliberation on which normative truths are instrumentally indispensable will render deliberation optional for us. Even if most people do usually evaluate potential courses of action in ways that assume objective normative reasons, it doesn't seem irrational to base my actions simply on my desires. I don't need to believe in objective normativity to care about things, and those attitudes, the things I care about, that can guide my actions. I can liberate. It seems to me that, so the real issue here is with this idea of deliberation as eliminating arbitrariness. I think there's something right about the idea. I think it is just right that deliberation aims to eliminate the arbitrariness of a given decision, and that you eliminate arbitrariness by citing reasons. That probably is rationally non-optional. One obvious way to eliminate arbitrariness in decision making, one way to make it so that you're not choosing by just flipping a coin, is to consult your desires. But Enoch, it seems that for Enoch, right, deliberation involves something a bit stronger, right? Deliberation aims to eliminate the arbitrariness of whatever underlying reason motivates the decision we take. So it has to eliminate the arbitrariness not just of the decision, but the arbitrariness of the desire that motivates the decision. And that's what gets you to objective normative truths. But that project isn't obviously rationally non-optional. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical that project is even normal. I'm not convinced that most people, most of the time, are even trying to do that when they evaluate courses of action. But yeah, that's that. So that was Enoch's deliberative indispensability argument. Very interesting argument, not one that I ultimately find persuasive, but obviously there's a lot more to be said about it. So that was just an introduction. Hope you found it interesting. Thank you for watching.